Ever wondered how top companies really turn their people into their biggest asset? Today I'm chatting with Mark Mitford, who went from HR at PepsiCo to building game-changing HR playbooks for growing businesses. If you're ready for real talk on transforming your team and your profits, this one's for you. Let's dive in. Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's going to be a great conversation. So, Mark, you spent the first 20 plus years in HR leadership inside large companies like PepsiCo and Ericsson. What did you see at that altitude that most small and mid-sized companies never get access to?
Sure. I think the biggest thing is that most of them have a very disciplined, they have an HR team, and I'll say that plural for a team, of course, but I would say they would have a team of HR people. Some of them were business facing. They work directly with a VP or general manager of a business. And then they had a group of subject matter experts, which a lot of times now is called like a center of excellence. And they could be in benefits, compensation, transformation, leadership development. So I would say the biggest thing is they have a very professional and specialized group of HR professionals on board. And then they have the business-facing people who are typically called by title HR business partners, because their first and foremost goal is to work directly with the business leaders, have a seat at the table with the business leaders, and work with them directly to take care of all of their human capital needs.
Absolutely. And those business partners are the face of HR for those business units, which really provides deep service delivery, customer experience, bringing all of the great things that HR has to offer.
Exactly. And sometimes they will project manage with that center of excellence. And they'll be, like you said, they're the primary salesperson, or they're going to be the customer experience person who is helping to work with the business owner and be actually able to drive that strategic agenda with them and be able to make that all happen for them very seamlessly.
Seamlessly is a wonderful word to use. What made you consider building a fractional model for HR for your business?
I'm a person of strong faith and been that way for actually the majority of my life. So I think actually God had a different plan for me very openly. So I found myself my last 3 corporate stints where I was still a W-2 employee. I dropped down in size significantly from Fortune 500, like you mentioned, an Ericsson or a PepsiCo, to smaller companies who I would classically consider middle market size companies. They were anywhere between about 50 million in revenue all the way. The largest one was significantly bigger, was about 500 million in revenue and global. Well, 2 of them were global. I dropped down in size and I wasn't looking for that opportunity. It actually came and found me through a professional recruiter or a headhunter. And I really enjoyed having that overall view, soup to nuts of HR, which I hadn't had before. When I was within a larger company, you're very narrow and deep in certain disciplines. Whereas this one, you're much more broadly focused. So that was about my last 8 years of my corporate life where I headed up HR within those respective businesses. Then I found myself within my last opportunity in a corporate environment to where I honestly, at the point I was in my career, and I would say I was at wherever you'd say in my career life cycle, but let's say the top of the mountain or the top of the heap, so to speak. But I had been working for over 20 years in HR, and I was very set in the type of organization I wanted to work for, the culture, the CEO who I worked directly for, and there was a total values misalignment between what I believed in and what the CEO and the company was about. And 6 months into that, I decided I would actually have a heart-to-heart with them. And after that conversation, I told them I was not happy where I was. So I was a classically disengaged employee or actively disengaged employee. And I knew that I was, again, in my point of career and life, I said, you know what? Life's way too short not to have fun at what you're doing, because you spend, unfortunately, good or bad, as you spend most of your working life at work. We had a talk, and about a month later, I exited the organization with not a solid plan B, but I guess God's plan for the plan B was to start my own business. And hence, that's when Catalyst was born in the latter part of 2013. And so it's been a great ride so far, 13 years and going strong. That's where the whole idea of moving into this fractional role and starting my own business and adventure from there was really created.
Fractional is so interesting because it allows you to work with a number of clients at the same time, and it keeps things very interesting, I think, versus being in one environment all the time.
That's what I truly love about what I do now. And right now, probably, let's say 6 clients. So 6 clients I'm working with. Some fractional people do not work with as many clients, but the engagements vary tremendously around the scope and complexity and length. So it really is a broad array of not only industries, some of them are family-owned businesses, some are privately held businesses. I've worked in that private equity space. So just the dynamics of it and the diversity of clients. Also aligned with that is the diversity of challenge they have, and how much stuff needs to be fixed or created is really intriguing. And I'm the type of person who loves creation and creating things and helping to being a builder. Yeah, so that's where if you're in an executive position in a corporate environment, and I was for years, you probably spend your third of your week in meetings.
Yeah.
And some of those meetings honestly are not value added for you, but you have to be there because of your title or where you sit. So you may be sitting in a 2-hour meeting and you really have very little to do with anything related to that meeting, but you're required to be there because of who you are and the position you hold, which it really is somewhat of a time waster in a lot of situations.
I do struggle with that, sitting in meetings where it's not really a value add. I know that there are times when other people in the business need to have a connection to you to feel like I know that Mark is always there for me. And so sometimes those meetings, even though they may feel not the best use of your time, it is a great investment in relationship as well.
Exactly. It is a double, like to your point, it's sometimes you just have to have the FaceTime and you need to be in that meeting, even though it's not related to your function. But again, sometimes you have to be that kind of good soldier and you have to attend. And in some cases, you glean a lot of good information, because if it's a very business related situation, then I would say yes. I was always a huge fan. For several years, I had HR teams working for me. I'd say go to the business meeting. Don't go to the HR meeting if there's a conflict, because you'll learn a lot more in the business meeting, because you will just gain credibility with the business leaders who, obviously HR is a support function. So we're there to support the business. So sometimes the FaceTime is really invaluable.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about your book, which I have right here next to me. I absolutely love it. People are your profit. Yeah, there you go. Yes. Transform your biggest expense into your biggest asset. It is an absolutely fantastic, I would truly call it a playbook for strategic HR. Most leadership teams already say that our people are our greatest asset. So what do you think the gap is between saying those words and actually running the business that way?
I think the biggest thing is, again, it's a tagline. Oh yeah, our people are the most important. That's who we care for. But I think it's almost like the swan. I think that's a nice thing to look at. And the swan looks beautiful on the lake, just swimming along gracefully. But when you get underneath the water, the reality, just to give you some demographics of the organizations that we typically work with, focus on, lower middle market size companies, usually 5 to about 75, 100 million in revenue. So this is lower middle market. I think a lot of bankers would define it that way. In a lot of cases, first and foremost, they don't have a professional HR person on staff. For companies it's not uncommon for companies that are 20, 30, 40 million in dollars. They have a person who does payroll. They have somebody who does benefits. And oftentimes, let's say 50% of the time, the HR function reports in through the CFO or controller. And for the life of me, these people are great. They're very gifted at what they do, but most of them, they have no professional training in people. And oftentimes their skills and core competencies are really not that people oriented in the first place. They're a very much more numbers oriented person, and the numbers tell the story. Whereas you, as well as I do, know there's a lot of shades of gray within people. So I think the biggest, to put a bow on that question, I think it goes back into when you look at, if they say this is truly, their people are their most important asset, they have not invested in the HR function, human capital function. They're really putting a very minimal investment into it in comparison to the rest of their business.
That is a great way to tell the story there. They really haven't invested in human capital, and I completely agree with that. You connect culture, recruiting, leadership development, performance management, and employee engagement directly to profitability in the book. Tell us about how one of these might show up as a number that a CFO would care about. Just create like an illustrative example.
I'd say the biggest one, let's give you a very kind of the low-hanging fruit. I would say recruiting. So we go into recruiting, hiring, selection. That in most cases, it's a very disjointed, every time it's done, if you're not recruiting heavily, let's say you bring in 20 people a year, let's say within an organization. So within 20 people a year, or 15 or 20, let's say, you're not doing that continuously. You may have some little peaks and valleys, but every time it's done, you don't have a recruiting strategy, first of all. I point out in the book, too, that you've got to have your job description. If the company has job descriptions, let's put it that way, your job description does not equal a job posting. In many cases, a job posting you should have if you have a marketing person or marketing department, you should have them help you to make the job posting much more really showing off the organization. And it's really more of a marketing tool than it is a boring, dry job description. So that's first and foremost. A lot of job postings are very boring. They're not going to attract the right people. So everything from job posting is, in a lot of cases, is very poorly done. And the verbiage in the job posting is not good. And then also internally, the interview process, a lot of times the interview process is very haphazard. I'm a big fan of having structured interview questions and making sure that everybody who's going to be involved in the interviewing process, they have a game plan as to exactly what they're going to be asking candidates, which manager or leader is going to be asking which candidate what questions. And then the other big thing too, I would say, which is sometimes a really major miss for a lot of companies, is asking people about cultural fit and asking them questions around your core values and the cultural fit. Because one of the biggest misses organizations have is they don't interview for culture. And so they may have somebody who's very technically competent, but actually, I do a blog post too, and I've got a blog coming out on this. So it's almost like you have this, you wind the clock forward a couple of months, it's Thanksgiving, and you have the awkward uncle who is always saying things they shouldn't be saying, whatever it is, even if it's everything from foul language to maybe they had a couple too many glasses of wine before Thanksgiving dinner. and they're speaking inappropriately about another relative at the dinner table. It's almost like that cultural thing is just that the culture has to be in the person's character qualities. That's a lot of companies don't interview for that. And I would say that's a major miss. They're only doing a technical interview and they're really missing. Let's talk about how you get work done. Let's talk about when it comes to integrity or servant leadership or customer focus, which could be core values. And that's a major miss that a lot of companies that I work with, it's a very common miss, which could be glaringly huge because you hire somebody, then within 3 to 6 months, you're looking at actually terminating them because they weren't really a good cultural fit organizationally.
I think the culture fit is absolutely huge because I know how awkward it can be when you're in the wrong place personally. And so I think more questions need to hone in on what the company's core values are and how that person fits, and just get a wider lens into the person's will outside of their skill. So their will to show up and deliver excellent work.
It's so true. Like, just like what you said, Sarah, you just hit the nail on the head. We know skill versus will is a big part of it because sometimes the person may not have. I know one of my clients that's not a current client right now, but that person was in a retail environment and they found that one of the biggest things they really enjoyed was they actually would sometimes hire people that were working in the hospitality, the restaurant industry. They saw how that person interfaced with customers. And so you find in some cases, some organizations are open enough and strategic thinking enough, they actually will be hiring people who are not actually in their industry, who end up to be really good hires because they bring some of those core traits and some of those things that are not technically. A lot of companies are like, we can teach you the technical side of the business. In a lot of cases, that's not that difficult. And some it is, of course, but in others, it's really not. But we want to hire the person who has the right character traits and they have the right will and they're going to be dependable, because a lot of companies really, they have a major miss there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, within 3 months, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, so looking at actually releasing that person after they spent all that effort and energy in hiring them, and they probably didn't do a really good job on the hiring and selection side of it from the first place.
Yeah, hiring, if you can get hiring right and improve your results there, it can really drive tremendous growth in an organization very quickly. Mark, the book really is aimed at the small to mid-market company, specifically because those are the businesses that your business focuses on today. What are some of the things that these companies get wrong that large enterprises have figured out decades ago?
Yeah, probably two things. There's the correlation between the two. I would say quite a few lower middle market size companies, they do little to no leadership development. They don't invest in their leaders. Is glaring. One of them is around compliance, because sometimes they may say stupid things very openly. Icing on the cake there is they actually put it in an email or a text. And so that is very bad, to be polite. And the other thing is they lack communication skills to be able to focus on inspiring motivating their employee base. And so that's why in the US, we still have the vast majority of US workers are either disengaged or actively disengaged. There's about a third that are actually engaged, and they actually really enjoy the work they do. They enjoy the people they work with. And when that occurs, you're going to get more productivity out of that person. The person's just going to be much more effective at their job and be able to be more productive.
Those are really low numbers, by the way.
Yes, it's amazing. And those numbers, Gallup tracks it. So the huge Gallup organization, and those numbers, if anything, they've actually gone down over the last few years. They haven't gone up. Even though we invest so much, the larger companies invest a lot more in this, but leadership development, because that's kind of that tip of the spear around inspiration, motivation, engagement, career development. And then the other big thing I'd say, if there's one more major miss, I would say, is around succession planning, that a lot of companies do really great job at. And I'm sure it's still this way because it was there when I was there. You mentioned PepsiCo. This actually, ironically, this month, we're recording in July. Typically, the CEO of PepsiCo, corporate PepsiCo, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry, spends the full month of July focusing on succession planning and her leadership pipeline for executive positions. And she's looking at the top positions. These are the people who are running multi-billion-dollar organizations within the company, or they're running IT, or they're running finance. She understood that growing, grooming, developing, understanding your talent landscape is huge. And sometimes it's really difficult to explain to an owner or a CEO of a business that's 100 people why they need to do something similar. The classic example, if it's a privately held company, is you may have somebody who's 62 years old running the company. It's like, I'm not going anywhere. Well, how do you know you're not going anywhere? You may have a huge life event yourself or your spouse or one of your parents or whomever that all of a sudden you can no longer work. It's not a nice thing to do. It's a mandatory thing to do, is continue to look at your talent pipeline and who are the successors for those top positions within your company. And in often cases, they have no idea who those successors are going to be. And also, they don't know who is that next generation of leadership that you need to identify and you need to develop, and you also need to retain them. It's critical for any organization to be able to do that at least annually.
When you think about even your own personal estate plan, it really requires you to think about what would happen, how you would convey things. And when you're in a business environment, if you're not thinking about it, when you get to the point where maybe someone makes an offer to you unsolicited to buy your business, those are the kinds of things that are going to help someone that actually acquires a company. If they understand the talent landscape at a much deeper level, they are going to be much more interested in confirming the sale because they understand what they're getting. It may not feel to some small to mid-market companies that's something that they need to do today, but I would second all of your comments and just urge leaders out there to really consider getting a very clear picture of your talent and understanding and defining that succession plan. I was just talking recently with a CEO that needs to do that very thing, develop her own succession plan. Large enterprises are great at this, but I think any size organization can do a miniature version of what a category leader like PepsiCo does.
And some companies I've done this with and sometimes I continue to do this with them. It's definitely a little bit less complex than an organization that has hundreds of thousands of people, of course, but it's still very robust. And sometimes it does identify some gaping holes in their organization. This is a business insurance that is very much focused on the human capital side of your business. Why wouldn't you spend a week or 2 or 3 focusing on this? Because it's really imperative for any organization, and that's just really a good business process.
Mark, you write about moving leaders from guesswork to disciplined execution, focusing on getting to a plan that you're executing against in a disciplined way. What does guesswork look like in practice? And what's the first sign a leadership team is operating that way without realizing they are?
In a larger organization, they would have a very set HR calendar of what happens when during the year. Obviously, one of them is benefits enrollment. You do benefits enrollment in every organization annually. You work with a broker, you do a benefits enrollment, you look at your benefits design, you negotiate rates and what have you, and then you roll out new benefits plans to your employees to sign up for on an annualized basis. But I would say when it comes to HR, in a lot of cases, there are organizations I've worked with, they have 200, 300, 400 employees. And in some cases, those employees, they don't do regular performance evaluations is a big one, whereas most companies do performance evaluations after their fiscal year closes. And so I would say for a calendar year, fiscal year, which a lot of companies are on, you would do performance evaluations in probably, let's say, the January, February time cycle. Then you would probably do salary increases probably in March. After you have the financials closed and audited, you'd say, okay, let's see how much money, let's see how we did last year officially. So you'd look at salary increases to base pay, but then you'd also look at possible bonuses. So if your company pays bonuses, then that's something else you would do. So it's almost like having a cadence around when you're doing certain major HR activities. When are you doing succession planning at? Making sure that's an annualized event. So there's a lot of core things that should be happening. One of the key things is, first off, is that these events do occur. And it's not uncommon. I'll work with an organization and I'll ask a person, when's the last time you've had an evaluation, performance evaluation? And here's, let's say, a 10-year employee. And they might say, I haven't had one in 6 years. And then similarly, I may say, well, when's the last time you received an increase, a salary increase? Well, the only way I get an increase at this company is I have to go and complain to somebody who's one of the leaders and tell them if I don't get an increase within the next month, I'm going to quit. And then they'll scramble and then they'll look at doing an increase. A lot of companies, the common denominator is quite a few companies do HR work in a very reactive fashion. Let's bring in some proactivity to the HR function for the employee base and also for the leadership team. So it works both ways. It works for the ownership. You should be following a very rhythmic activity with these types of things. In finance, you know when you're closing the books monthly. You know when you're doing year-end close. You know when you're going to do forecasting. So those are things that are very financially driven. Just about every company of every size does that on a regular basis like clockwork. Similarly, in HR, you should have that same rhythm. So you know, these are the activities we're doing when within the calendar year or the fiscal year. And we just need to be planning on it and also planning within the business, the operations function, within the finance function that these activities are going to be happening. So that creates a level of transparency and also helps to set up the organization to be successful versus everything in HR is a scramble. Most things should not be a scramble in HR. Sure, you may have people resign, hopefully giving a 2-week notice. Some people don't do that anymore, unfortunately. And it's just a situation to where organizations in the last 5 or 10 years have just had to deal with.
Mark, when you step into a new client that has never had HR leadership, what do you look at in your first 30 days?
So in the first 30 days, I'd actually like to do an HR assessment. And I have something which I use for years within the business, the STAR model. And the STAR, unfortunately, is not an acronym, but I wish it was, but it doesn't. I've looked at it 20 times and it just didn't work. But the STAR model, if you envision a star and having 5 points on this star, or going from 12 o'clock at the top. So if you go around the STAR model to the different points, so you have strategy, structure, people, processes, and rewards. And I would actually ask a number of people. I would get a nice sample size within the organization. And I would ask them specific questions. Everybody gets the same questions, regardless whether you make $20 an hour or $200,000 an hour. I'm asking the same questions to everyone. It's really trying to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly of the organization. And every organization has some good, they have some bad, and they have some ugly. And unfortunately, in a lot of organizations that I work with, they have a lot more bad and ugly than they do good. So the diagnostic is done as an initial assessment, and then there's an executive summary, executive meeting that will occur after all the results are consolidated to actually give a broad brush picture of the state of the HR organization internally, or in a lot of cases, the lack of the state and the dysfunctionality within the HR function. And then from there, in let's say 90% of the cases, they decide to engage with HR Catalyst to help. We will give a set of recommendations at the end. And from there, that will actually create a strategic roadmap for an organization to engage with us and actually go forward and actually work with them, and ideally work with them on a multi-month, sometimes multi-year roadmap to work on a number of those core initiatives that are identified coming out of that assessment.
In those first 30 days, and when you're doing the HR diagnostic, what tends to be the biggest risk areas or the biggest opportunities? Are there trends that you see?
One of them would be very poor communications and transparency organizationally. There's no town halls, there's no round tables. The first level employees who are actually doing a lot of the work, sometimes they have no idea strategically where the company's going. They have no idea financially how the company is doing. They have no idea about the core wins the company's had recently. What are some of the core initiatives that are being worked on? So communications. The next thing is, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, I would say there's a lack of transparency around compensation. Sometimes there's this black hole around compensation. You don't have to share everything about compensation, but I do help a lot of companies create compensation ranges and compensation grades or bands for their employee base.
I think that helps tremendously. And with all of the laws that are getting passed in this space, it is becoming much more important for employers to be transparent.
And you may not like the response, but at least you understand the response. It doesn't mean that the pay range for a position is between $60,000 and $80,000, for a quick example. Everybody thinks they should be paid $80,000 because they're so good. But if they're 6 months into the role and they have very little experience, they're probably going to be paid closer to $60,000. They understand there's a method to the madness around compensation. The third item there would be it's around leadership development. And the first and mid-level leaders have probably had very little to no investment done around equipping them to do their job as leaders. That's a huge deficiency, as I mentioned a few minutes ago.
It is a big problem. Whenever you promote someone to their first manager role, that's really a critical time to make sure they get some of that initial how to be a good manager, how to work with staff, all of those basic things that really determine success in the role. It is so important. On any project, I'm constantly talking about developing more leaders at more levels of the organization. It's not just about the top leaders. It needs to be about literally creating that capability throughout the business as much as possible.
And we offer some focus around a leadership boot camp, very focused, very subject matter oriented on some of the core disciplines. It's almost like the building blocks for leadership: motivation, how to build trust in an organization, effective communications. A lot of people, in most cases, people are promoted into a leadership role because they're good at their job. It has nothing to do with their capability and having some of the core capabilities of leadership. And those two skill sets or competency, there's very little correlation between one and the other one.
So, Mark, you've talked about building foundational HR systems that can scale with a company and their growth. What's the difference between HR and infrastructure built for where a company is today versus where it will be in 3 years? And why do so many companies only build for today? So frustrating.
Yes, exactly. So I would say, first and foremost, they have no HR leader on board. They don't have anybody strategically minded in the HR seat. And quite often, the HR seat at the leadership team level or leadership level does not exist. So it's simply, in some cases, it's a total ignorance. So they don't know what they don't know because they focused on every day running the business. I would say another thing is some companies do a very poor job of strategic planning. Strategic planning to them is thinking about, let's say, 2 to 3 months out. There isn't any thought leadership in the HR function. There's nobody who is thinking about, okay, if we're planning to grow if we have a pipeline of opportunities and business opportunities coming through, we're growing 20% year over year, very aggressively. They have nobody sitting there creating a people architecture or people designed to say, okay, we're probably going to have to add another level of leadership. We're probably going to have to move from a controller to a CFO. We're probably going to have a CMO, a chief marketing officer. In some cases, especially if it's a family-owned business, they simply haven't seen it. So they've lived in their own little world, and that's what they know. And they live in their bubble. So having somebody who can actually help to architect a people strategy with them, not for them, but with them, and to be thinking about, okay, if we're going from a $30 million company to a $60 million company in the next 5 years, and that's a good solid projection, there's going to have to be a lot more sophistication in our leadership team than there currently is to be able to scale effectively. And in a lot of companies, they miss that mark. And then what happens is that aggressive growth plan starts to diminish very quickly.
I could see the fractional roles across all of the big functional areas become even more important. For example, a fractional CIO in partnership with you and in partnership with the CFO seems critical for many businesses that may or may not have it. Maybe they have an IT manager, and that's their most senior person in the function. So I definitely see that being a critical success factors for companies that are truly wanting to set themselves up to grow. Mark, you've helped companies by literally building their entire HR function as a fractional HR leader and then handed that off to a client to take and run as a self-sufficient organization. And that's got to be incredibly satisfying. How do you know when a company has outgrown a fractional HR leader?
A little bit of it is because the way our model works, in most cases, our largest fractional opportunity with a company to really remain fractional, where we have the capability to work with multiple clients simultaneously, our highest retainer we would work with on a company monthly would be 40 hours per month. And of course, you look at that 40 hours a month as one work week. So the biggest thing is a lot of times they need more time than we can devote to them. So that's usually one of the biggest triggers. And in some cases, they start doing the cost benefit analysis. And they may say, you know what, Mark, and which I would agree with, I will help to partner with them to make that happen. They may say, well, I think we can get a solid, let's say, an HR director. Okay, we really need to bring in an HR director. And of course, a lot of times I would say, yes, I concur, because they need somebody who can be there more than 40 hours per month. Let's say an HR director is going to run you 150 to 180K base plus bonus. The financial model supports that they can bring in a person with that kind of horsepower or they might have an HR manager who I work with who can be promoted to that role. So then in a lot of cases, it really comes down into they need more of the time than our model demands we can give them. Therefore, it becomes a situation. And again, this is a very transparent conversation that I've had multiple times, that you're really in that position now from a financial perspective and also from a needs perspective where you need to bring on an HR leader in a full-time capacity. So part of it's just driving it by the agenda is becoming so full, it no longer works within you. The balloon is full.
Yes.
The balloon's going to explode because, well, Mark, we also need these 4 major things. And I'm like, well, I don't have time within my current engagement with you to be able to devote to that. Right now, I can do that in a month or 2, and they may say, well, we need it now. Well, that's the conversation which will, in some cases, trigger the justification for bringing on that HR leader as a W-2 employee.
For the CEO that's listening to this, who knows their people strategy is really thin, but has never had the budget or the time to fix it, what is their best first move?
I would say probably the biggest thing is to, Sarah, and I would probably not challenge you, but the question I think too is really coming down to most organizations, the vast majority of organizations, the expense line that's the largest in your company is going to be your people expenses. So I would say the biggest thing that leaders of organizations need to be thinking about, don't look at this from a cost perspective, look at this from an investment perspective. If your current turnover rate of how many employees you lose annually, this is people turnover. So if you have 100 people in your company, your turnover rate is 20%. That means you lose 20 people per year. So if your turnover rate is 20 people per year or 20% or 25% or whatever the number is, and if an HR person coming in on, let's say, a fractional basis, if we can help you lower your turnover rate from 20% down to 10%, the savings there could be $500,000 annually, or possibly even $1 million annually, just in that example.
That is a great and meaty example, because when you reduce turnover, you're saving on so many things. You're saving on company culture. You're creating a culture that's sticky, where people want to stay. And then you're not having to pay for recruiting and all the other costs of exiting employees. Mark, I really appreciate your time today. Is there anything else that you would like to share that is specific to the book or your business in working with clients?
It's an HR playbook. People Are Your Profit. It's out there on Amazon right now. So I would say that it's written it's not an academic book by any means. It's a very practical guide of I never started out as a professional consultant. So I started out in the trenches of HR. That's where I started my career over 30 years ago. So I would say, if nothing else, get the book. So pick it up on Amazon. It's out there right now. People Are Your Profit. And give it a read. It's probably, depending on your reading speed, it's probably about a 2-hour or less read. So I'd say that's a good place to start. The last point there is, I would just say, if you're finding that your biggest challenges from a business perspective are all related to people, then I would say you need to do something on the people side of your business, because that's a huge part of your business that will really drive your growth and profitability. And if you'd like to have a conversation with me for 15, 30 minutes, if you're in Dallas area, if you wanted to meet for coffee or lunch to discuss it a little further, I'm very much a servant leader at heart. So I'm very much about helping people understand the basic thesis of what we do. And I'm happy to have that conversation and see where it goes from there.
Fantastic. How can our listeners find you, Mark?
Probably the best way to connect with me is LinkedIn. You can also find me through our website, www.hrCatalystConsulting. If you love listening to podcasts, we have a podcast channel, which is HR Problem Solver. So that's probably the best way to do it. And I would love to connect with you again very sincerely. If you have questions or things you wanted to set up a a conversation with, whether it's in person or on Zoom or Teams, I'm happy to do that and would look forward to having that conversation with you.
Thank you so much for your time today, Mark.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks for your time, too.
Here are 3 key takeaways for CEOs and C-suite leaders. Proactive people practices drive profits. Most lower middle market companies invest minimally in HR, often burying it under finance and rarely making it strategic. Building an intentional people strategy is what turns HR from a cost into a competitive advantage that directly impacts your bottom line. Leadership development and succession are not optional. The companies with real staying power develop leaders at every level and put succession planning at the center of the agenda. Think succession planning is just for Fortune 500s? Even a 100-employee business is one unexpected life event away from risk, but almost none have a talent bench. Move from reactive firefighting to disciplined execution. Guesswork is not a growth strategy. Successful companies establish regular HR rhythms, performance reviews, compensation planning, leadership training, to minimize surprises, maximize retention, engagement, and performance. As you reflect on the challenges that you're faced with in your workplace, prioritize human capital strategy and adoption in the process. Look for the Meet With Me link in the show notes to explore how I can help you navigate change with ease.